Hello, I'm Susan Thomas, the training coordinator of the institute that Dr. Wolf Wolfensberger founded at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York, when he came there in September 1973. Its full name, as you see there on the projection, is Training Institute for Human Service Planning, Leadership, and Change Agentry. I started right out of college as secretary and eventually became one of several training coordinators at the institute, then the only one, which is what I have been for almost all my many years there, and I still am. Since Dr. Wolfensberger's death in 2011, I've been trying to keep the institute going to continue his teachings. The topic I will be presenting on, you see there, is an effort to trace the timelines of the development of Dr. Wolfensberger's ideas. But before I get into that, I want to do some introduction and explanation for this topic. To Dr. Wolfensberger, the idea of coherency, of everything being connected and consistent, of an aesthetically pleasing, elegant oneness or seamlessness to things, that idea was very important. The word coherency appears repeatedly in much of his teaching, including in the titles of several workshops he developed. The concept of model coherency, how to function with personal moral coherency in a dysfunctional world, crafting a coherent stance on the sanctity of life. And as I hope you will see, there's also a coherency among or across the various topics on which he taught. For instance, citizen advocacy is coherent with, it fits with personalism. And normalization and social role valorization are coherent with, they fit with protecting the lives of vulnerable people. All these topics I will come to soon in this presentation. And further, the idea of each human being as a unique and integrated whole that could not and should not be segmented or fragmented, as is so common today, where people's parts get seen and treated as separate and separable. This too was very important to Dr. Wolfensberger. I mention this because in this presentation, I hope you will see some of the many aspects of his coherent identity that I will be treating separately, but that really cannot be factored out from each other or from the totality of the man. So he was or strove to be a coherent person. And I hope that, as I said, that becomes evident through the presentation. Now, I drew on several sources to help me chart the timelines of Dr. Wolfensberger's work. One was his own writings. In addition to his many publications, he kept personal journals, especially early in his career, in which he would note places and programs that he visited, things he saw, people he talked to or heard speak and teach, and these notes gave indications of his thinking. As I reviewed these, I tried to note anything that seemed to take his fancy, that he thought worthy of recording his reaction to or of reflecting upon. For instance, he might write that he saw an impaired person engage in a task that surprised him, so perhaps he had never seen a handicapped person do that before, or maybe he even thought until then that it was beyond the capabilities of such people. So jottings like these in his journals and diaries might indicate the first time something came across his awareness, or at least sparked his attention, and that in the future he would be on the lookout for more along these lines. But over time, he got busier, and unfortunately, that meant he eventually left off, with a few exceptions, keeping such extensive notes. In particular, I was looking in these journals for entries that showed an insight, a lesson, an incident worth remarking, and so on, as I've just explained. Any of those things that could be clearly tied to any of 26 topics I selected on which he taught and wrote. I have a list of them here, in alphabetic order, not in order of their importance. First, advocacy and anything related to it, and citizen advocacy specifically. Death-making and anything related to threats to the sanctity of human life. Devaluation in general and the wounds that accompany devaluation, and devaluation of the elderly more specifically. The developmental model, including the power of expectancies and the power of the physical environment. Drugs, especially mind drugs. Evaluation of service quality. Families, family concerns, and the parent movement. Human service history. The relationship between human service and religious faith. Innovativeness in and of services. The L'Arche movement and the spirituality of mentally retarded people. Limitations of the law and of rights, empowerment, and self-determination. models of service and model coherency, normalization and integration, the philosophy of personalism and its implications to how to live in the world and to serving upon others, precision teaching developed by O.R. Lindsley, the planning of services and service systems and anything connected with that, his rejection of the culture of academia, service system dysfunctionality, limitations, and stagnation, what can be expected of services and how to live and act coherently within them. The shift from more informal ad hoc presentations to prepared ones and anything else to do with his way of teaching. Social roles and social role valorization, universals, and work for handicapped persons. Now, with two exceptions, these are, in my judgment, most of the major topics on which, over the course of his career, he taught and gave presentations and workshops, and or where he did much study on. Worked on his other PhDs, we might say. I'll come back to that. Or else, there's something like themes that run through much of his work instead of or in addition to being a separate topic. And the concept of universals is a good example of that. It's both a theme as well as a separate teaching topic. And again, I'll come back to that. The two entries on the list that are not of this nature, not content topics or themes like the others, are his rejection of the culture of academia and anything to do with his way of teaching. But they were very much part of his work, even though they weren't content topics. A number of the topics that I have selected here will be taken up in more depth and detail by others for this Festschrift. And by the way, these 26 are not all the topics on which he worked and wrote and spoke. They're only the ones I selected. I'm going to mention some more at the end of the presentation. I said something about the additional PhDs. At the Training Institute, we used to joke about how many unofficial and unrecognized PhD degrees Dr. Wolfensberger had, because he gave the same depth and seriousness of study and work that's required for a doctorate to every topic he took up. So he had what we might call unofficial PhDs in social advocacy, in pedagogy, in the killing of handicapped people under the Nazis, in numerous aspects of human service history, in social devaluation and what lies behind or under it, in the philosophy of personalism, in dynamics of the families of mentally retarded people, in human service planning, in drug use on devalued people. And that is not all. I've probably left out a few. Now, of course, it's also possible that his mind was already prepared on a number of these topics, even if he did not write something in his journals about them. He once told a small group of us that, quotes, serendipity crowns the prepared mind, which is a variation on Louis Pasteur's saying that chance favors the prepared mind. And in fact, he liked that saying so much he posted it on the bulletin board at the Training Institute. Now, to return to my sources, I also consulted the very good records that were kept of the speeches, presentations, and workshops that he gave. However, these records were much more systematic from late 1973 onward, when he came to Syracuse and established the Training Institute, than for his previous places of work. So unfortunately, a lot of the years prior to his arrival in Syracuse in 1973 are much harder to reconstruct. And thirdly, the third source, I also drew on my memory, which, as we all know, is notoriously unreliable, at least about certain things, which is amazing since we do rely so heavily upon it. And while I used to think I had a good memory, I'm well aware of having lost some of that capacity in recent years. I like to think my mind is occupied with more important things now, not those little details. But anyway, my memory, such as it is, I drew on. I also consulted with some people who were present at certain events at his career to get their memories. I would like to have also drawn on the memories of yet other people who were around Dr. Wolfensberger at critical times, but of course I neither could remember them all, nor could I get in touch with them all, some of them being dead and some of them otherwise difficult for me to locate and contact. My own memory of Dr. Wolfensberger covers almost 40 years. As I noted already, I started as his secretary a little over a month after he arrived in Syracuse in the autumn of 1973, and with one very short break and another somewhat longer one to go back to school, I worked with him at the Training Institute until his death. Now, before going any further, I want to say a word about words. As probably most people who hear this presentation will be aware, the issue of what terms to use to refer to various conditions and the people who have them is a highly charged and controverted issue. And what is considered currently acceptable varies a great deal from group to group and even place to place, as well as over time. Terms that were once considered proper can become verboten amazingly rapidly. In fact, this is one of the topics on which Dr. Wolfensberger thought and taught and wrote over the course of several decades, usually in connection with normalization and social role valorization, but also with what he termed human service craziness. Now, I bring this up because I'm going to use the language that Dr. Wolfensberger himself used. If I were to put terms that he never did use and probably never would use, and especially terms that he explicitly rejected, if I were to put them into his mouth as if he said them, or into his pen as if he wrote them, that would be the worst kind of historical revisionism. So you should reconcile yourself to hearing words you may not be used to and appreciate their historical context and usage. After all, this is a common practice in historical reporting, where words and phrases of an earlier era are cited even if they have fallen out of use and out of favor. And a second point about words, if anyone is not very familiar with Dr. Wolfensberger's work, the terms devaluation and devalued people that I will often use might sound strange. They refer to the fact that people always and everywhere perceive and judge others. And when they judge some people to be of low value, or even of no value at all, and treat them in denigrating ways, we say that is devaluing those people. In contemporary Western societies, the groups of people who are the object of such devaluation include at the very least those who are impaired in some significant way, particularly those who are mentally impaired, as well as those who are elderly, poor people, and members of minority racial and ethnic groups, such as new immigrants to a culture, particularly if they don't speak the culture's language. And of course, there are many more groups besides, but that gives you an example of what I'm talking about. Now, because of the limited time for this presentation, I'm not going to be able to look at all 26 subjects. So I've pulled out for us to look at just a selection, 8, out of the 26 subjects of Dr. Wolfensberger's work on which I did some digging. The chapter on this topic in the book that will be published for the Festschrift looks at all of them, but even there I do not cover each in the same length or the same detail. Also, in the chapter for each topic, I summarized the number of events of which I could find record on which he spoke to that topic. And almost always these were in the multiple tens of times, so 20 times on this or something like that. And for some topics, even close to 100 occasions on which he spoke on it. And by the way, on most of these topics and more, Dr. Wolfensberger also kept audio tapes of at least one version of a presentation or workshop that he gave. These tapes are in the Wolfensberger archives at the University of Nebraska School of Medicine's Health Sciences Library. And particularly where there are tapes of multiple presentations on the same topic, they would be a valuable resource for tracing changes over time in what a presentation or workshop covered and in changes in his thinking about it. So let's begin of the 8 selected topics. The first one that I've pulled out is the topic of advocacy on behalf of devalued people and for specific devalued persons. This was long a concern of Dr. Wolfensberger's, and it must have begun early because he remembered that in the mid-1950s, and I'm quoting now from something he wrote, his sense of justice was outraged by the conditions in the so-called back wards of a mental institution in Nebraska, end of the quote, where he was working as a psychology intern. So, at least from the mid-1950s, he was angry enough to be advocating about something. Also, some decades ago now, a colleague of ours was able to access records of the state school in Indiana, where Dr. Wolfensberger worked for several summers in the late 1950s. And this colleague found clinical notes that Dr. Wolfensberger had made then about a particular resident, where Dr. Wolfensberger pleaded in his notes that one embarrassing incident be expunged from the man's record and that his honor be restored. So that was an early incident, 1958 or 59, of his advocating on behalf of a lowly mentally handicapped man, and it continued his whole life long. In November 1966, he was sent to the United Cerebral Palsy Conference in New Kensington, Pennsylvania, where he heard all the shortcomings of various advocacy and protective schemes for mentally retarded people, and where he first suggested the germ of the idea that became citizen advocacy. In citizen advocacy, unpaid ordinary citizens become personal advocates on behalf of specific impaired individuals. He further developed this idea while in Nebraska in the 1960s, and it was first implemented there. He also thought that citizen advocacy should be an integral part of a comprehensive normalization-based community service system, not just a luxury add-on. So that was 1966. And then just a few years later, in January 1971 in Iowa, he was beginning to record in his journal wonderful citizen advocacy vignettes, as he liked to call them. For instance, he noted that one institution resident went out of the institution for the first time as an adult because a citizen advocate took her out. But he was also already beginning to think about problems with citizen advocacy, such as if an advocate moves, how does that affect continuity with the person they're advocating for, called a protege in citizen advocacy. In that same year, 1971, he wrote in his journal that the adaptive attitude of services to advocacy was to welcome it, to say, I need an adversary to myself. But such an attitude on the part of services was exceedingly rare and still is. Most services find advocacy at best interfering, at worst something to be stamped out, particularly when the advocacy is exercised against them. But already he was saying that should not be the idea. At a November 1977 meeting of the board of the National Association for Retarded Citizens, he told them, again I'm quoting from his journal, ultimately, if a significant number of citizens are not personally close to individual devalued people, nothing else we do will work, not laws, funding, research, workshops, or even education, end quotes. Such personal closeness for ordinary citizens with devalued people is almost the essence of citizen advocacy. When he came to Syracuse University in 1973, he taught a graduate course on social advocacies in the spring semesters of 1974, 76, and 78. In late fall of 1973 in Syracuse, he co-founded an advocacy group for the elderly, and that was when he first began to teach about their social devaluation. The first workshop on advocacy of which I can find record was October 1970, the last May 2003, though probably there were some even earlier. We simply do not have the records, as I explained earlier. In 2010, Jerry Smith from Minnesota interviewed Dr. Wolfensberger for a film he was making about him. The film is entitled Valuing Lives, Wolf Wolfensberger and the Principle of Normalization. Well, in those interviews, Dr. Wolfensberger said that out of all his work, citizen advocacy was one of the most satisfying things he could look back on. Next, we look at one of the most controversial topics on which Dr. Wolfensberger taught and wrote, death-making, a word he coined that refers to both direct and indirect measures that abbreviate and even take life. Once he himself was awakened to the reality that death-making of handicapped people was being legitimized in our societies today, he made speaking against it one of his most important missions. Already in October 1968, according to his journal, genetic counseling was being discussed at conferences on the handicapped. And 2 years later, it was reported that 50 conditions were by then identifiable in utero through amniocentesis. Such genetic counseling and early detection so often lead to abortion of any unborn considered, quotes, defective. For instance, as of at least 2018, both Denmark and Iceland have declared themselves free of Down syndrome by virtually aborting all such children. It was at a May 1973 conference in Ohio on mental retardation law that he recorded in his journal first learning of a Florida law that proposed so-called euthanasia for severely mentally retarded residents of its institutions. And that was also the place where he first heard of the bioethicist Joseph Fletcher defining 15 characteristics that he considered necessary to qualify for humanness. And of course, that move is very, very hostile to handicapped people who may not rack up enough points in Fletcher's scheme. The National Association for Retarded Citizens Conference in California in October 1973 was the first time Dr. Wolfensberger spoke publicly about the threats to the lives of handicapped people. Another record notes November 1974 in Ottawa, Ontario, as probably his first public address in Canada of the issue. In these early presentations and ever after, he explained how euthanasia, and he always put it in quotes, inevitably follows on abortion, which had been legalized in the U.S. in 1973. And he also explained that the values that he saw being embraced in society both supported death-making and even demanded it. He first called these values hedonism, and eventually grouped them under the name modernism, and he greatly elaborated on them in his teachings on threats to the sanctity of life. Well, as Dr. Wolfensberger continued to speak on this issue, he grew increasingly marginalized and lost his mantle as the golden boy of mental retardation. He could not get hardly any support to teach on the issue, nor could he get support for his stance of opposition to death-making, not even from parent associations or from university departments devoted to special education and other services to those endangered by the death-making. In fact, in his 1984 and 1985 journals, he wrote that he was very disappointed on trips to England and Canada at how they were unable and unwilling to tackle new big problems such as death-making. 1981 was his first publication on the parallels and the lessons between the killing of the handicapped in Nazi Germany and practices in our own contemporary societies. The first workshop, as opposed to a speech on threats to the sanctity of life, which I could find a record, was February 1979, and the last June 2009. In 1999, his colleagues Beth French, Joe Massarelli, and Joe Osborne suggested that he start a group that would intensively study the content of the 5-day workshop on threats to the sanctity of the lives of devalued people, with the purpose of seeing to it that the workshop would continue after he was no longer able to teach it. Dr. Wolfensberger agreed and christened the group the Sanctity of Life Salon, after the 19th century French salons in which people would meet to discuss ideas. This salon has met continuously at least once a year since then. It has added some new members and has mounted many workshops. Dr. Wolfensberger faithfully attended all the salon's meetings until his death. The next topic is social devaluation and the common wounds that accompany and express it. I very briefly explained social devaluation at the start of the presentation. I believe he began to use these terms sometime in the early to mid-1970s. Before that, he spoke and wrote about deviancy, a sociological concept that refers to people being put and kept at the margins of society, whereas devaluation refers to the fact that people perceive and judge each other as being of more or less value, and those who get judged as of low value, or at least less value than other humans, hence being devalued. Now, one expression or manifestation of devaluation is the infliction by powerful parties of harmful experiences on the devalued person or group, physical, mental, emotional hurts or wounds. I believe he got this term from the L'Arche movement, in which handicapped and non-handicapped people live together in community. In 1963, he noted in his journal that some relatives of handicapped people, particularly those in institutions, may disappear for a long while and later pop up again. I saw that as an early noticing of the wound of social and relationship discontinuity, which refers to the fact that in the lives of many devalued people, there are people who are constantly coming and going, but few of them stay. So you see the family would disappear and then maybe pop up again, a discontinuity of relationship. In that same early entry, he wrote, quotes, "A searching, agonizing inquiry into our failings in proper treatment of the mentally retarded, especially the young," end quote. And that seems to me to reflect a recognition that the services provided were hurting, were wounding the very people that they served. Much of his 1969 notebook is from a trip of several weeks in the spring that he made to Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. He noted a point made by Carl Grunewald, one of the Swedish fathers of normalization, that in some groups, the lower functioning people dominate, whereas what is desirable is to have only one or a few lower performing ones so as not to overpower the whole group and so that the other group members can pull them up, so to speak. This is the first written notation of his thinking about group composition, and specifically about groups reverting to what he called the lowest common denominator, meaning that whatever was required for the lowest functioning, least competent, least cooperative member of a group would be imposed on all the rest, even on those who did not need such restriction. In 1970, he heard Harold Russell, who was an actor who lost his arm in World War II and appeared in a celebrated post-war film called The Best Years of Our Lives. He heard Russell speak about stigmatic disability and pity images of handicapped people. Of course, pity and charity images play a big role in perpetuating social devaluation. But 5 years earlier, October 1965, is actually the first mention in Dr. Wolfensberger's notes that the perception of a person as a citizen is preferable to seeing the person as an object of pity and charity. So he had that in there in 1965, and then he heard Russell speak about it again 5 years later and thought it was worth writing about both times. In 2000, he made a note in his journal about one handicapped man who had no one who touched him without getting paid. And that is reflective of the wound of being deprived of natural relationships and having only paid or bought-in ones as a substitute for freely given relationships. He also built up this particular wound into a short workshop he developed in the early 2000s on dilemmas of paid services. That was one of the last public presentations that he gave before he died. And he also addressed it in the long workshop on how to function with personal moral coherency. Also part of this topic was his teaching about devaluation of the elderly specifically. They were one of the first groups beyond the mentally retarded to whom he tried to very systematically apply normalization so as to remediate their devaluation. I already mentioned he co-founded an advocacy group on aging in 1973. But the field of aging was not at all receptive to this teaching about devaluation and about doing something about it, for reasons which would be very interesting to discuss, but they go beyond the scope of my topic. Now, the difficulty with trying to document how often he taught on social devaluation is that it was embedded into so many teachings and writings, including those on normalization, social role valorization, and threats to the sanctity of life. And as well, the Training Institute gave separate teachings, separate workshops, you might say, on devaluation and the common wounds of devalued people. So there was an awful lot of that teaching going on. Next, the next topic that I've selected is to look at families of the handicapped and their concerns. As far as I can tell, Dr. Wolfensberger was sympathetic to the plight of such families, and especially parents, from back in his early institution days. On arriving in Omaha in 1965, he joined the local Association for Retarded Children, as it was then called, and he was active with that association and maintained his membership for his whole life, even after he had moved away. He also joined the local associations in Toronto when he went there in 1971, and in Syracuse when he arrived there in 1973, and also maintained those memberships until his death. He was speaking on parent and family issues as early as 1966. He wrote a chapter on counseling parents of the retarded for a 1967 book, and in 1969, a book he co-edited on management of the family of the mentally retarded came out. October 1969 was the first writing I found in his notebook about voluntary associations, such as the parent-based groups in the future, being watchdogs of services rather than providers of services, and also in the future being designers and experimenters of new service models. He eventually wrote this up as what he called the third stage of such voluntary associations, and he also taught it in connection with other workshops such as the one on service planning and change agentry. January 1970 is the first mention he made in his notebooks of the change of the name National Association for Retarded Children from Children to Citizen, National Association for Retarded Citizens. That was a name change that he definitely approved because, of course, there are also adults who are retarded, not just children who are. Also, as I noted in the earlier coverage of social devaluation, he had taught from as early as 1965, that citizen was a much preferable way to interpret handicapped people over that of object of pity and charity. However, at a 1986 celebration in Toronto, he jotted a note in his journal that families do sometimes want what is bad for their impaired family member, as in requesting aversive treatments and even infanticide. So he was not under any romantic illusions about parents and families of handicapped people, much as he was a supporter of them. Just before making the shift from normalization to social role valorization in 1983, he published a monograph on providing normalization-based guidance and support for families of handicapped people. And one of his last books in 2003 was this one on what parents fear and want and what to do about it. It reflected the concern that he had recognized and sympathized with from at least the 1960s, a concern that had given rise to the idea of citizen advocacy that I talked about earlier, that parents so commonly fear for the future of their impaired sons and daughters. Who will take care of them? Where will they live? And very importantly, who will love them? He gave about 10 workshops specifically on family concerns and family responsibilities from November 1981 onwards, though he also spoke on other topics at many events oriented to families and attended by families, such as at conferences of the U.S. and Canadian parent associations. But as I already said, at least their leading organizations and associations quit inviting him to speak when he started teaching and wouldn't stop teaching about death-making, and when he began to criticize so-called self-advocacy by mentally handicapped people. The next topic for which I want to trace the development of Dr. Wolfensberger's ideas is service models and model coherency. A model is the framework of ideas and assumptions about what works and what is needed on which a service is built. One of the most common models and easiest to explain is the medical model, which assumes some bodily source of a problem and then applies medical means by medically trained personnel to take care of it. Model coherency means essentially that all the parts of a service fit together harmoniously and are well designed so as to incisively address the needs of the recipients. Like so many others of his ideas, model coherency underwent a long process of evolution and refinement. In 1962 and 63, he spent a year of postdoctoral study in England. One of his assignments there was to study the service system for mentally retarded people in the county of Middlesex. It had a dispersed, centrally coordinated network of moderately diversified community services. Diversification of services was, we might say, a predecessor of what became a key premise in model coherency, namely that there should be different kinds of services providing different things to different people according to their different needs. Another preceding concept of model coherency was service specialization. That was the name of a rating in the first and second versions of the PASS tool for assessing service quality. These editions were in 1969 and 1973. By the time of the third edition of PASS in 1975, that rating was called model coherency. Dr. Wolfensberger said he first heard about this idea of service specialization in 1959 from one of his professors when he was studying for his doctorate. In 1968, Dr. Wolfensberger drew on that idea to sketch a wide range of different types of specialized residences for the mentally retarded when they were crafting the plan for reforming mental retardation services in Nebraska. He also included this idea of different types of specialized residences as what he called a, quotes, cardinal feature of residential services, end quotes, in the 1969 book, Changing Patterns of Residential Services for the Mentally Retarded. And this, by the way, was before he had really grasped and embraced normalization, 1969. But it is not until January 1971 that Dr. Wolfensberger recorded for the first time in his journal that he thought the institution, which is a big incoherent service form, that he thought the institution could only be entirely done away with if there were specialized services. In other words, there had to be many different types of services based on different models. Otherwise, there would always be some people whose needs were not the focus of some specific kind of service who would fall through the cracks, as the expression goes, and for whom the institution would then be seen as the necessary place of last resort. So if you wanted to get rid of the institution, you had to have a wide range of specialized services. And January 1971 was the first place he actually wrote that in his journals. But all through the 1970s, the Training Institute gave week-long workshops on community residential services in which the sketching of the many different types of model coherent residential services for mentally retarded people was a central topic. Along these same lines, Dr. Wolfensberger also used to teach that there used to be only 3 options for mentally disordered people: the institution, independent living, and the halfway house. It was called halfway because it was halfway between the institution and independent living. But these few options required people to make too big a jump to move from one to the other. There needed to be more options with smaller steps in between. Once again, more different types of specialized or model coherent residences to address different needs or degrees of need of different kinds of people. The first explicit presentation on the topic of different types of specialized residences was in December 1969. But earlier that year, he was already referring to different types in his notes. Later, he also noted the tension between a residence being specialized or model coherent and at the same time preserving continuity of residence. In other words, as a person's needs changed, the person might have to change residence rather than remain in the place where the person may have established a home. So he recognized the tension between specialization and the need for continuity. In 1970, he recorded in his notebook an exercise in identifying underlying but unspoken assumptions in a service. Assumptions are a crucial component of a model and of model coherency, but they are often unspoken, implicit, and unrecognized. All through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, he spoke on several occasions about models of residential services, models of service in the field of mental health, Scandinavian service models, models of services to families, and the developmental model. And the last writing project of Dr. Wolfensberger's life was a big 3-volume book on model coherency. You see only one of the 3 volumes here. It was only published in 2021, 10 years after his death. We now shift to another topic. From the early 1970s through summer of 1979, Dr. Wolfensberger had taught a 6-day workshop on service planning and change agentry. You will learn about it in another presentation of this Festschrift and another chapter of the book. But then, in 1979, he ceased giving that event, and he invented and began to give instead a workshop that was first 6 days, then eventually 7 days long, on how to function with personal moral coherency in a dysfunctional world. That's moral coherency, not the same as model coherency, which we just finished talking about. However, there was a long build-up to this development too. For instance, as I cited to you earlier, already in his 1963 notebook, he had written a searching, agonizing inquiry into our failings in proper treatment of the mentally retarded, especially the young. You remember that quote. And that speaks to a recognition even that early that services were not meeting the needs of those they served, which is, of course, a big problem when services are not meeting the needs of the people that they serve. Also, throughout the 1969 records of his 2-week trip through Scandinavia, he noted shortcomings of their services, as well as the good things, but shortcomings is what I'm focusing on here. In 1973, similarly, he began to record that even the newly established services in Nebraska that were based on normalization had their shortcomings. In November 1973, he wrote in his journal, and it has an exclamation point for emphasis, that, and I'm quoting here, exclamation point, "My speech was inadequate without making clear that ultimately no safeguard will work or be adopted unless a certain attitude plus value prevails first." End quotes. This idea that even safeguards will fail became incorporated into his teaching on the fundamental dysfunctionality of services, because he taught about the fundamental dysfunctionality of everything, including safeguards to protect services. In June 1974, he spoke about outright evil at the convention of what was then called the American Association on Mental Deficiency, the major professional organization in the field. confronting the reality of evil as being behind many of the bad things that got done to handicapped people became a major topic in his teaching on service dysfunctionality and on acting morally within it. Then, in 1976, as I already noted in connection with death-making, he spoke to the National Convention of the same American Association on Mental Deficiency about our society's growing embrace of values that are morally wrong and harmful to devalued people and to services to them. And he also spoke about the societal decay and destruction and death-making to which those values would inevitably lead. By 1978, he had recognized that a wide range of elements and details, such as those he taught in the workshop on service planning and change agentry. Remember, he was teaching that workshop first, up through 1979, and it had a wide range of all sorts of things that had to be meticulously and successfully implemented in order for complex, comprehensive service systems to work. Their very complexity and comprehensiveness required that everything had to be done and done right and in the right sequence and so on. But over and over, people who attended that planning workshop were reporting that they ran up against all sorts of obstacles to doing what that workshop taught, and they were even being punished in various ways for their efforts. So that's happening all along. Okay, now finally, 2 meetings were held of Training Institute staff, both of these meetings in 1979, in which the deep shortcomings of services that had been revealed by hundreds of past evaluations up until then were discussed. And it was these 2 meetings that finally made Dr. Wolfensberger decide to leave behind the teaching of the Planning and Change Agentry workshop and to offer a new workshop to provide service workers strategies for living with integrity, with moral coherency within this sad situation. And he made this decision even though the Planning and Change Agentry workshop was very well developed and the teaching it contained was still valid. This new workshop on functioning with moral coherency was first given in September 1980 in Atlanta, Georgia. I mentioned earlier that he had written in his notebooks in 1984, 85, and 86 on trips to England and Canada that the people he heard and met were unable and unwilling to tackle new problems on the service scene. And similarly, he noted that they were circulating the falsehood that only professional service workers did all the harm to impaired and other devalued people, but that families and voluntary service and advocates did not. And this was a falsehood that he challenged in this new workshop on the dysfunctionality of services and functioning morally within it, because, as he explained in that workshop, it's a world in which everything, including all human beings, are dysfunctional, not just the professional ones. In 1986 was apparently when he first came across the work of the social analyst and critic John McKnight, who explained the real but hidden function of human services in the contemporary economy, namely, to keep lots of otherwise unemployable people employed as service providers. And in order to maintain their employment as service workers, there have to be needy people who can be defined as dependent and then kept dependent on services. Now, of course, this also means that the devalued people, the devalued service recipients, are the food of the service system. And this was one of those teachings that he incorporated into the teaching on service system dysfunctionality. In October 2000, the Training Institute gave 2 one-day workshops before the start of a citizen advocacy conference held in Omaha, Nebraska. Omaha was where Dr. Wolfensberger had lived in the 1960s when the Nebraska Community Service System, which was then a world model, was being established. Now, one of these 2 one-day workshops before the conference was his Reflections on a Lifetime in Human Services, in which he presented on all the current problems of human services, including in the once vaunted community services. Well, I can tell you that workshop was not well received there, especially by others who, like him, had spent so many years building that very service system. Some parents were particularly mad at him there. From 1980 through May 2008, the Training Institute gave 17 of these workshops on functioning with personal moral coherency in a dysfunctional world, including its human services. The one in May 2008 was the last one of these at which Dr. Wolfensberger participated. But in addition, he spoke to students on the dysfunctionalities of human services and gave separate presentations on obstacles to service quality from October 1987 through February of 2004. Now, you remember I explained earlier that in 1999, a group was started to continue the teaching of the workshop on threats to the sanctity of life. Similarly, that same year, another group was begun to be able to continue the workshop on functioning with moral coherency. As with the Sanctity of Life Salon, Dr. Wolfensberger faithfully attended all the meetings of this study group, which has met continuously at least once a year since then, and has also mounted many such workshops. The next topic that I've selected is not one on which Dr. Wolfensberger wrote so much as one that he modeled and for which he is most well known, and that is his method of teaching, with multiple screens and projections. Typically, he used 3 overhead projectors and 1 or sometimes 2 slide projectors to show pictures. July 1970 in Minnesota was the first time he used 2 projectors to show at the same time a slide of bad practices on one screen and a slide of good contrasting practices on the second. Later in his life, he grew much more analytic about the problems of an increasingly technologized world, and he rejected most computer technology for a multitude of well-thought-through reasons. He noted in his 1967 notebook that he liked someone's use of colored slides in a presentation. He incorporated such slides in his own teaching, and for a while he used a lot of color on his overhead transparencies. He also always tried to give to young people that he was bringing along and developing opportunities to give presentations themselves and even to create some presentations. In 1970 was the first, or at least the first recorded one in his notebook, the first instance of feedback that he gave to newer and younger presenters after a presentation, and most of the feedback was in the nature of critique. In January 1971 in Iowa, he noted the importance of images to underline or reinforce a teaching point. And of course, he incorporated many images into his own teaching. In the 1960s and 70s, Dr. Wolfensberger's presentations were almost off the cuff, using just a few note cards. But over time, he shifted to more prepared, almost scripted presentations. There's no written record I can easily identify of when his presentations began to be more formal. My memory is that this started in the late 1970s, though it took a while before most of his presentations and workshops changed in this way. And there were several reasons for this change. One was to make it easier to give material to new people, such as students, for them to prepare the presentations they were charged to do. Another was that he wanted to develop presentations into manuscripts for possible publication, which would enable more widespread dissemination of his teaching. After all, more people could read a book than could attend any workshops. And hopefully this would also ease the demands of travel on him. And yet another reason for developing the presentations into prepared manuscripts was that he could include in written manuscripts much more material than there was usually time to present during an event. The written material, so it was written down, but it didn't get presented because of time, that written material was, but unpresented, was usually marked in presentation notes as long, meaning it could only be presented in events that were longer and had more time. Or it would be marked as speaker resource, meaning it constituted background material for the speaker that fleshed out the presentation notes. So it was preserved, even though in a possible manuscript, even though it wasn't actually given. So I want to conclude this little section by sharing with you Dr. Wolfensberger's own vision of heaven and hell, which I believe began as an unprepared ad hoc response to a question that came from a workshop participant, and which he then liked to retell on suitable occasions. He said that heaven for him would be to be able to give an endless workshop with enough time to allow for all the long, unabbreviated version of the material that he had worked up, not having to cut anything. And hell That would be the experience of all the people who had to attend such an endless workshop. And they would have to adhere to the discipline, which was the standard rule for all Training Institute workshops, of waiting till the very end of a presentation to raise any questions or objections. But since it was an eternal, endless workshop, the very end would never come. Oh, that was so funny. Okay. I've selected for the last of these topics in this short presentation, universals, a subject on which he taught, as well as a theme that runs through so many of the other topics of his study and teaching, as I said at the very beginning of this presentation. So, for instance, he taught an entire course on universals. It was one of the first graduate-level courses he taught at Syracuse University, starting in the fall of 1973 and continuing each year through spring 1983. But he also taught about the pedagogies that are most universally powerful as part of that course on Human Service Universals. And he also taught about universally powerful pedagogies in an abbreviated form in some workshops and some courses on normalization, and in a separate workshop on pedagogies. So you see, it was both a topic as well as a theme. The Training Institute gave workshops on universal human needs and on universal service issues. But universals were touched upon in just about all Training Institute workshops in one way or another, and many of them even contained a module on the concept of universals. For instance, in the workshop on threats to the sanctity of life, the universals of death-making are covered. In the workshop on functioning with personal moral coherency, universals of human nature and of collective functioning and of social stratification and of human services are covered. And in the workshops on social role valorization, universals of human perception and of social devaluation, and universals about how to address it, all of those are covered. However, the idea of universals was not one that many people in human services learned elsewhere. In fact, it was a disdained idea. For instance, at Lincoln, Nebraska in January 1971 is the first time he recorded hearing, "It may work in Scandinavia, but it won't work here." In other words, first time he heard that response that of the mindset that rejects universals and focuses on particulars and particularistic differences instead. Now, of course, Dr. Wolfensberger taught and wrote on many other topics besides even the 26 that I have listed here. For instance, conflict of interest was a central part of his teaching on advocacy, but there was also a separate freestanding half-day workshop on conflict of interest. There were separate workshops and teachings on attitude change, on normalizing community residential services for handicapped people, on the dynamics of voluntary associations, on what happens to devalued people in times of catastrophe and how to prepare for it, on what leads to violence in human services and how to prevent it, on the liberation of devalued people from bondage and oppression, on the nature of that impairment that used to be called, and that he called, mental retardation, on personal relationships as the ultimate security for impaired people, on the signs of the times and their implications, on, well, as I said at the start, on so many topics on which he did the work for and could have earned yet more PhDs. So to wrap up, I've written a crude timeline to capture some of what I have presented to you and what I have elaborated considerably in the chapter. It is, I believe, a good estimate, more than a guess, more even than a good guess, but with not every detail yet nailed down, a good estimate of which topics he picked up on or began in which decade of his working life. And here they are. As you see, beginning in the 1950s, advocacy, the developmental model and the power of expectancies, families and family concerns, service models, and social roles. Beginning in the 1960s, service innovativeness, service evaluation, citizen advocacy, normalization, service planning and change agentry, work, and universals. Beginning in the 1970s, social devaluation, death-making and threats to life, service dysfunctionality, the limits of the law and of a rights-based approach to service problems, L'Arche, human service and faith, human service history, the philosophy of personalism and its many lessons for life and for human services, and precision teaching. and beginning in the 1980s, the use of drugs on devalued people, and a shift to a more formal presenting style. So we can certainly see that his was an active and engaged mind, attentive, observant, that he stored things, so to speak, for retrieval when and as they would be needed. And the time at which he brought forth a topic or subject in his teaching and writing was often long after he had first begun to notice it, to think about it, and that it had first begun to work within him. Now, anyone familiar with Dr. Wolfensberger's work will know that he collaborated with many people. Other chapters in the Festschrift book mention some of them. Also, as I already noted, he developed and promoted students into leadership roles. However, trying to name them all is beyond this presentation, and I fear overlooking someone. More likely, I would overlook many someones. But I do want to mention one person and their book, namely a 2003 book by Dr. David Race of England, one of the many colleagues of Dr. Wolfensberger's and who attended many Training Institute events. This book is a selection and edited compilation of 7 areas of Dr. Wolfensberger's teaching, all drawn from his own writings, most of which I have also included, most of the topics I've also included in my chapter on this issue for the Festschrift book. The reason I mention it is that Dr. Race's book is a sort of predecessor and very useful elaboration, so to speak, of the tracing provided by my Festschrift chapter on the timelines in this little presentation. And I want to conclude by saying that in putting this material together, I have learned that trying to capture even a part of someone's life is a daunting task, full of possibilities for error, and I gained a much greater respect for those who fill the role of biographer from it.